Very good morning to you. I'm Malcolm Graham Wood, and I'm here at Core Finance TV to do a CEO interview. I'm delighted to say that today's guest is Dr. Robert Trice,
Morning,
CEO of Hurricane Energy. Good morning, Robert.
Morning, Malcolm.
Great to see you again. Today's interview is intended to be a detailed and focused run through of Hurricane's operations. I'm going to take as read most of the fact that people know a lot what's going on, because we're going to go through it in some detail, and I'd like to be a little bit technical today. We know that there's a lot going on. I'd like to concentrate a lot on the drilling in the Greater Warwick area over the next year or two. But obviously, first of all, we must talk about Lancaster and the early production system. Mm-hmm. Why don't you give us a nice update on what's going on there right now?
Okay. Well, as we talk, commissioning is ongoing. As you're aware, last month the buoy was tied to the FPSO, and we're just undertaking the commissioning work that'll get us to first oil in the first half of this year.
So you're online for the as you already
Absolutely.
Said.
Yeah. So we're on budget and we're on target.
This will involve a process which involves a gradual building up of the wells, gathering data and so on from the.
So basically,
what I'm trying to get at is that some people who think you just go in, plug it in, and switch it on. It doesn't quite work like that.
No, it doesn't quite work like that. So after the commissioning phases, the last part of the commissioning phases are about 20 days. We'll be bringing the wells on individually, both under natural flow and with the electrical pumps. And that's for two reasons, really. It's one, to give the geoscientists sufficient information and the engineers sufficient information that the long-term behaviour of the wells and the long-term behaviour of the FPSO is optimised. So that means that our production continues without minimum hindrance.
Excellent. What I'd like to ask here is sort of how on earth did you manage to get all the way to here? Because I went out to Dubai with you some time ago and saw the Equities being redone, and the size of the kit and everything else. How would you describe the scale of the operational achievement here?
Well, it's phenomenal. It's something like 2 million man-hours in Dubai alone, and constructing the buoy. We all talk about connecting the buoy, but we mustn't forget that started as 1,000 tons of separate pieces of steel, all had to be put together again. Then there's all the laying of equipment and the subsea in the very harsh conditions of the west of Shetland. We did benefit from some good weather, but really it's the members of Hurricane and the members of our Tier 1 contractors, their hard work that's made us achieve this on budget and on time.
Excellent. So that was some feat, no doubt about that. But the second part of the question is, you're tackling a basement reservoir here, which in the UK is the first time this has ever been done. Now, you've done a lot of work on international basement work, but tell us, what's the significance of the fact that you're likely to be producing from basement reservoir in the UK for the first time?
Well, it's the head of the creaming curve. I mean, it's basically the first time it's been tried. So that means the opportunity for additional reserves that the UK doesn't assign is there. So potentially material growth for the UK. We see the EPS as being the next catalyst for further interest in the basement in the UK. Other companies are looking at UK basement, and of course also in Norway. If you just take the Rona Ridge published numbers, there's something like 30 billion barrels of oil in place has been described and published. And of that, Hurricane's 3.5 billion recoverable resource is what we're getting after at the moment.
And we'll come back to this in a minute, but this is only phase one of a substantial phasing process over all the different parts of the licenses that you hold.
Indeed, it's the EPS is really the big missing link. We've found oil, we found that the reservoir's there. We've been able to describe it. What we haven't demonstrated is long-term productivity, and that's really what the EPS is about. It's to gather that data and give us assurance that the next investment in the next part of the Lancaster field development can be optimised.
Excellent. Well, we'll all be watching with interest and excitement over the next few weeks and months. you haven't been standing still while everything's been going on at Lancaster, and this huge operational process has been going on. Towards the end of last year, you signed a transformational farm-in deal with Spirit with regard to the Greater Warwick area. Why don't you talk us through that, and we can go through it in some detail.
Yes, certainly. Well, I suppose a high-level point is it's allowed us to develop two streams to our business in parallel. The great thing about the Spirit deal is that it's designed to accelerate a development leading to a 500 million barrel reserve by 2021. So it's innovative. Both Spirit and Hurricane are fast movers. We have a clear plan to that, and and it kicks off with 3 wells this year.
Yeah. So the total number that I read about was something like $387 million worth of carry. Does that sound about right?
That's about right. It's not all in one big lump. No. It's basically a phased approach. There's 5 phases, and that's the maximum success case, assuming we're going to go for a large reserve. If there's a smaller reserve, a smaller field development, obviously the ultimate quantum will be paid back.
And you're carried in its entirety year 1,
yes.
And you share the cost in year 2, and so on.
Exactly. So basically, we carried on 3 wells this year. 2 wells on Warwick, 1 well on Lincoln, and then the following year we'll be paying our contribution to additional wells.
And after you've done the first 3 wells this year, you're planning to tie them back with the FPSO next year, and then drill the 3 years next year tied up like that? Is that so?
It's basically 1 well is going to get tied back. So in a success case, either Lincoln or Warwick Deep will be tied back to the Akamuzu. It's a similar kind of distance to the tieback we've seen from Lancaster, so the engineering is known. And then in 20, there will be 3 additional wells drilled. The idea being that by the end of 20, we'll have 6 wells that have been suspended and are going to be used as production wells for the future field development. That's the intention.
So let's go into the detail of the 3-well program that's going to start. I've been guessing at sort of mid to end April, but that's sort of time. There are no details yet. Talk us through the 3-well program.
Yes, so the first well is going to be, as I said, Warwick Deep. So that's going to be the deepest well. In fact, it'll be the deepest horizontal well we've drilled. It's going to be something like 680 metres deeper than our horizontal wells on Lancaster. And the purpose of that is to evaluate the deeper fracture system. We know from Lancaster and we know from Lincoln that there is deep oil. What we've never done is tried a long-term or a long production test, and that's what we're going to achieve, just to demonstrate that, in fact, that part of the fracture system behaves no different to the shallower fracture systems that we've investigated in Lancaster. And
you've always known that Lincoln and Lancaster were separate accumulations. Right here, you're talking about whether Warwick and Lincoln are separate accumulations.
Yeah, that's right. So basically, between Warwick and Lincoln, there's a large fault. You can identify that on the seismic, and it's potentially a sealing fault. RPS in their CPR of 17 took the sensible view that could be a sealing fault, and which means that we need to drill Warwick and demonstrate that it can talk to Lincoln, and that will help us support a single accumulation for the Greater Warwick area.
Because, of course, you drilled a well on Lincoln.
Indeed.
Which must have been a deep well, and you've had a chance to look at that, and now you're going to identify. The interesting thing is about these separate structures, particularly people like me who aren't as quite up to speed with the geophysics and everything else. In a way, it doesn't really matter whether because in the books, if I remember correctly, you've got a sort of 600 and 935 split in terms of contingent and prospective barrels of oil. And as you say, the RPS CPR said, they weren't going to give you the whole thing, which you fully understood. But it's not unreasonable to assume that either as all together in one or 2 different structures that they could go ahead anyway.
Yeah. So basically, Lincoln on its own, just taking the Lincoln block, there's over 600 million barrels recoverable. That's a sizable field development in its own right.
Yeah.
Warwick turns out either to be a separate structure or in fact dry, it doesn't stop the joint venture with Hurricane and Spirit going ahead developing Lincoln. And if there are two accumulations, well, we shall have to see how that's accommodated going forward. What I will say is that both Hurricane and Spirit have got plans. What if plans? What if this well doesn't work? What if that well doesn't work? How do we take the 20 drilling forward to optimise a development? And that is in hand.
So let's talk about the actual wells, the 3 wells, and how they identify with those structures with 1 or 2 or 3, and how you're going to drill them, what you're going to identify when they're there. And you mentioned pressure gauges earlier on, and I know that comes into it. So let's talk about the detail of these wells.
So each one's going to be drilled horizontally. They're going to be designed as production wells. They will be tested, so that will let us know what kind of oil is present and also the productivity of the reservoir at that location. The testing will also give us the reservoir pressure, and when we shut the well in, the pressure response will let us know if nearby the well if there's any pressure boundaries. So we're looking for those faults as pressure boundaries with a shut-in pressure. Then when we finish the well, it'll be suspended in the success case and it'll have pressure gauges left in the bottom. So in the case of the Warwick Deep, its pressure sensors are designed to be able to see the next well, which would be Lincoln, and then the subsequent well, which would be Warwick Shallow. And also, assuming that this well's in 2020, the pressure gauges will be seeing those wells in addition. In fact, we'll end up with 5 wells with permanent pressure, well, not permanent, but long-term pressure gauges in, and of course 1 well tied back to the Akamuzu. So we'll have a very detailed network to see how the reservoir behaves and if there are any pressure boundaries. And if there are no pressure boundaries, it tells us a hell of a lot about the fracture system. Remember on the Lancaster EPS, we've got 2 wells which are sort of done as a V, and we're looking at the connection of the fractures between those. These 5 wells and the long-term tieback are all designed to do a similar thing, but over a bigger area.
Excellent. Now, you mentioned that Warwick Deep was going to be your first, and the very deep well, followed by the Lincoln, and then the Warwick Crystal, I think.
Crystal well,
Yeah. Talk us through why did you decide to do it in that order? I mean, you mentioned briefly the fact that it's deep and that you've got the pressure gauges on.
So basically, its location is in between the other 2 wells, so it's good to get a pressure gauge in there early on. You've got more chance of seeing the connectivity. It's also the deepest well, and the sooner we can find out about how that fracture system behaves at depth, the easier the decision-making process will be for planning wells next year. Mustn't forget, Malcom, we're drilling and testing 3 wells, and at the same time we're planning wells for 20. Now the rig, we've already taken a tender out for a rig contract, and we've got to get site surveys and various other things. It's a pretty rapid operation.
You've come to my next question, really, because I know that you're moving very rapidly, and whilst, as you said, you're drilling 3 wells this year, you're already on the case quite a long way down the road for next year's drilling process. You've already tendered for the rig, apparently, I'd heard, and that although those presumably the locations of the wells will be to a certain extent dependent on how this summer's wells go. These are the 3 wells that that count for the moment, but next year is also very important.
Indeed, it is.
The longer term.
Yeah, exactly. As I said, 3 wells, but also 1 well tied back, creating the GWA its own EPS, early production system, because what we're trying to do is to achieve an accelerated field development of up to 500 million barrels by 2021. So that's accelerated data gathering, and that includes long-term production from the Lincoln or the Warwick tieback to the Akamuzu.
Yeah, and so you've got, I like the idea that you've got, you're in a process where there are never going to be any shortage of places to drill.
No, I mean, it's an enormous area, and we're not short of whole locations, to say the least.
So looking a little further into next year, where would you see, let's just do it in 2 bits. The end of this year, you'd like to have those 3 wells, you'd like one of them tied in, and the opportunities to assess whether what you've got in the way of a number of different connectivities
Well,
and
so
so on.
by the end of this year, 3 wells will be complete. We'd have made a decision which well to tie in. We won't have been able to tie it in quite that quickly, but that's something for the following year. And of course, we will be having some results from the Lancaster EPS. So by the end of the year, we'll have a really good handle on where we are on the Greater Warwick area. We'll have a clear plan of what we're going to be drilling in 20, and we'll have had some solid results from Lancaster. So what we're targeting for next year, 1H next year, is to have our reserve base go from its current 2P of 37 million barrels to over 100 million barrels of 2P reserve. That's the target for 1H next year.
And as people say, I mean, that means, when I first looked at this, I thought this is incredibly fast in terms of the fact that you'll be making a final investment decision in 2021 on the Greater Warwick area.
That's correct. That's the target.
And by then, you'll be, presumably producing from Lancaster, decided on what you're going to do with the Greater Warwick area, and can have a very good idea of the substantial value that this is adding to the business.
Exactly, and we mustn't forget it'll be a game of two halves. After those 6 wells have been drilled on the GWA, we'll be handing over operatorship for the Greater Warwick area to Spirit. Of course, they've got the experience of operations. They'll be taking over the feed for the field development plan, or the first phase of what we hope will be a phased field development. Mustn't forget, we're targeting 500 million barrels of a prospective 1.5 billion. You're not going to produce that with just one facility. So it's the first phase. Spirit will take that on, and then gives us the opportunity to go back to look at the Greater Lancaster area and the resources there, because we need to find a way forward for a broader development of the Lancaster field.
Just before I get into the sort of final question, because time always goes too quickly, in terms of offtake, at the moment, obviously, we're talking about an FPSO which takes, which does what it says on the tin. But in due course, you're going to have gas to deal with, and you may well end up piping the oil away yourselves. Is that in your game plan? So
the game plan, the first thing to increase our daily production, which is set at 20,000 barrels, is to find a disposal route for the gas from Lancaster, and that's going to be done through the Western Shetland pipeline. Once that's done, the intention is to augment the Akamazoo to give it the ability to take up to 40,000 barrels. So with 10,000 barrels coming from the GWA, that's 5 net to Hurricane, and the increase from Lancaster, that's a significant increase from our 20,000 where we stand today. So that's a plan. Everything's going to plan, you'll be pleased to know, and that's the next growth step.
I'm pleased to see it. I'm pleased to see that it's keeping your CFO busy with his gas sales discussions at the moment as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
They take a bit of sorting out, as I understand. We allow 20 minutes. We've already nearly blown the budget, as they say. But I wouldn't let you get away without saying, right, we've talked in the last 20 minutes about Lancaster, about the Greater Warwick area, Lincoln and Warwick, whether they're together or separate. We've already gone through, the situation about offtake and gas and production and so on. Can you put that all together and say, where would you like to see Hurricane in 18 months' time? That takes us to the end of next year. You've sort of alluded to it a little bit in terms of it, but why don't you give us a vision?
Will be successful wells on the GWA. That will be a tick in the box, proof that it's one great big structure. Progressing towards a final investment decision on the GWA development. The EPS doing what we expect it to do, so that's demonstrating there's at least a 500 million barrel resource there. And then at that point, we would be well on our way to planning our next GLA wells, whether they're on Lancaster or whether they're on Halifax. We mustn't forget, we think there's 500 million barrels on Lancaster, and there's another in excess of 1 billion potentially on Halifax, so we need to get after that. And that'll be a good place to be in 18 months' time.
And there's a hell of a lot of work there, and I'm very pleased because the valuation of Hurricane will then, I'm sure, put that into perspective. Thank you very much, Robert, for coming back again.
Thank you, Malky.
Today, I've been delighted to welcome to Core Finance Dr. Robert Trice, the CEO of Hurricane Energy. I look forward to coming back and doing another interview next time, and I'll see you again soon. Bye now.